Growing up, my parents used our Uncle Jeffrey in place of the boogeyman. When my younger brother was caught trespassing on school property after hours, my parents grounded him with shouts of, "Next time, we'll take you into a police car and have you go to jail with your Uncle Jeffrey." When I was caught throwing eggs at cars on Halloween, I remember my parents driving back from the scene of the crime with me in the back seat. The only comment they made for the entire ride home was, "Keep this up, and you'll end up like your Uncle Jeffrey." But how did he end up? I didn't know. The only times that they talked about him, they never said what he did that was so bad. "How does he look?" I'd ask. "Tall, mean, and rugged," my dad would answer. "He wore biker gear. He went to jail. He didn't go to church." That's all you need to know. Of course, these bare details that my parents told me only made me more curious about him. When I was younger, Jeffrey could only occupy two spaces in my mind: criminal and weirdo. I pictured him as some floating, nomadic character that was probably just too volatile to be seen with in public. Maybe he was like Captain Hook from that 90s movie, the kind of guy who would use his charm to turn against your loved ones. When Mom talked about him, she would speak in a disappointed tone and give vague details. "I know he's married, has 2 sons, divorced his wife, and lives somewhere in Michigan. That's it." In a rare instance where we visited our extended family for my cousin's college graduation, I tried to ask them. I would ask my aunt, Jeffrey's sister, why he was never at family gatherings. She would fix a cold expression, stare me straight in the eye, and say, "He's not worth talking about." My aunt never talked about anyone besides Jeffrey in this bitter, angry tone. He must have betrayed the family's trust somehow. Nothing else could be causing this kind of animosity. After asking several family members at this event about him, my dad took me aside and said, "Look, I know you're curious, but nobody here wants to talk about Jeffrey right now, okay?" "But what did he do?" I asked. Dad sighed. "Doesn't matter now. I'll tell you when we get home." But that revelation never came. Before that, I thought that exile was an acceptable thing to do I thought that exile was not an acceptable thing to do to a family member, and that it was only reserved for Puritans or dystopian governments. It did occur to me that when I was older that he could simply be gay, and my family had disowned him in a fit of Catholic rage, but no proof of this ever surfaced. My brothers and I were too young and had moved too far away to have any memories of our uncle. The way I saw my family members acting when they talked about him, I assumed that he was a dirtbag. Uncle Jeffrey became the butt of my brother's inside jokes in my formative years. Whenever a news story of a major crime came up, we always made Jeffrey the unseen criminal hand that was responsible for it all. A major drug bust happened, Jeffrey had sprinted out the back door in the nick of time. A building caught fire, Jeffrey had been the one to flick the igniting cigarette, walking away without even looking. Of course, none of this was true. Occasionally, my mom would be within earshot for one of the jokes being told. Sometimes she would scold us and tell us not to gossip. Most of the time, she pretended she didn't hear it. Years passed, and the Uncle Jeffrey jokes waned. Usually, they were only brought up as a trope at a Thanksgiving dinner or a wedding reception, events that he was never invited to. Then, when I was 10, my grandma died after a long battle with lung cancer. My mom told me that Grandma, who was Jeffrey's mother, was the only person in the family that would keep in touch with him. No matter how bad someone is, they always have a mommy out there somewhere. Her husband, Grandpa Tiger, seemed to be much less warm to him. He would pass only a year later from stomach cancer. I never knew either of my grandparents very well. Both of them died in their late 60s. My parents took it incredibly hard. I think they felt guilty that they had not spent enough time with them in their last few years. Even more so, I think they felt bad that my brothers and I hadn't either. The car ride from the Buffalo airport to our grandparents' house was only 10 minutes away. After reminding us to be respectful at the funeral and to treat our family, especially the elderly ones, with courtesy, quote, no matter how bad they smell, we asked our parents who would be at the service. Oh, Aunt Debbie and Aunt Sandy will be there, and Aunt Michelle will come from work. Jeffrey will be meeting us at the cemetery. We froze. My brothers and I looked at each other with stunned faces. Is it true? Why will we be there and not at anything else? My brother asked. My mom looked back and hissed, it's my mother's funeral today. I don't want any of you pestering him. We shut up right away, but my mind was racing. I was finally going to meet the infamous Uncle Jeffrey, but none of us said a word. We just sat in the back seat, fidgeting in anticipation. The cemetery wasn't on a rolling green hillside, but a dirty, almost industrial zone. It had an interstate highway on one side and train tracks on the other. There were some big monuments with huge angel statues and Celtic crosses that indicated wealthy people had been buried here way back when, but even they were falling apart due to lack of care. We stepped out of the car and immediately saw a figure draped in black with his back turned to us. As our family approached him, I tried to walk slowly so we could take it all in. My mom embraced Jeffrey while we awkwardly hung out to the side of her. My dad stood behind us, actually looking kind of bored, but didn't make a move to say hello to him. He had to be in, at the earliest, his late 40s, because his face was a nest of wrinkles and crow's feet. The stubble on his chin must have passed salt and pepper 8 years back and gone straight to gray. 6'5" and covered in black leather and metal studs, as well as a faded black Screaming for Vengeance t-shirt, topped off with an American flag bandana tied around his head. So far, he was checking off every box for the stereotype of a biker. I'll admit that at the time, I felt a little uneasy about him. But then when we got right up to him, I saw his face. It wasn't a mean, angry face, or the diabolical face of a criminal. He just stood there with the bandana folded in his hands, looking at the ground in the sadness that made his entire body droop. Liver spots competed with old tattoos for real estate on his wrinkled arms. A cold wind blew his wispy, graying hair around, despite his efforts to smooth it down, out of respect. The rest of my family, save my brothers and I, avoided eye contact with him. My mom gave him another hug, and they whispered a few things to each other. My dad approached him briefly and shook his hand. How's the garage job, Jeffrey? He replied in a dejected sort of way. That was the limit of my family's interaction with him. Even his own sisters sat in their folding chairs staring straight ahead while he stood behind them like a stranger. How could they be so cold to him on a day like this? The one common thread that should bring them all together was gone, and no matter what petty differences they have, they should be able to at least comfort each other. But his own sisters were too stubborn with their grudge, whatever it was, to even acknowledge him. This was the first time we met, but when my brothers and I introduced ourselves, he talked to us as if we had always stayed in touch. He reached out his hands to me, stained with 1,000 cigarettes, and gave me a hug. I could feel the heaving sobs in his chest reverberate against mine. I'm going to miss your grandma, Maddie, he told me as he wiped tears with the American flag bandana. She was a special lady. For all his outward appearance of toughness, we were seeing him at his most vulnerable moment, saying goodbye to his mother. I quietly interrogated Mom and Dad on the car ride home from the cemetery as to why no one was talking to him. What was so wrong with him? My dad would simply shrug and say, he's just never gotten along with the family. Let's just leave it at that. So what? He was difficult to get along with? That's it? If we exiled everyone in my family who didn't get along, there would be no one left. No way. That response never sat well with me. Now, I didn't think of him as a man to be feared and alienated. I just thought he was a normal guy. Nothing more, nothing less. I was incredibly angry with my family after that trip. There were so many moments afterward when I wanted to scream at them for lying to me, for making this man out to be an unmentionable black sheep. My parents thought it was oncoming puberty that was making me rebellious and argumentative, but I think it was the lingering resentment of ignoring Jeffrey that kick-started those first conflicts with my parents. I began to wonder if this is how Jeffrey had started, as a moody teenager who disagreed with his parents. Maybe the act of keeping Jeffrey away from me is what caused their fear to be realized, that now I was the rebellious one. As I got older, I laid out a plan. I would take my own visit to Buffalo to see Jeffrey. If they wouldn't answer my questions, so be it. I would get the full story from him, what had happened, how my family became this way, what his future held. I'd get to talk with the man instead of just talking about the myth. But I never got that chance. About 2 months after my grandma's funeral, and a month after Grandpa Tiger died, he committed suicide. He was 47. I've returned to Buffalo a few times since meeting Jeffrey, but almost always it's been for a funeral. My family now mostly lives in Southern California, and we do our best to visit each other regularly. The whole thing was summed up pretty well on the day of my grandma's funeral, when we returned to our hotel and watched Hook on cable TV. I was thinking about Jeffrey more than my grandmother, but then I realized how incredibly hard it must have been for her to keep in touch with her exiled son. She was just like him, up against the whole family, all because she took an interest in her son. At that moment, I took some solace in the fact that at least one, if only one, member of his family treated him like a human being. I turned my attention to the movie, which was at the climax, where Peter Pan's kids are trying to convince him to spare a defeated Captain Hook and take them home. The little girl screamed, "He's just a mean old man who doesn't have a mommy." That's not true, I thought to myself. Even Captain Hook has a mommy.
Matt Lewis.